The great hall shimmered with soft blue light as Daniel stepped inside wearing the formal uniform of Earth's envoy. The floor beneath him pulsed with a faint glow, alive with energy and ancient alien design. Towering pillars curved high into the mist-covered ceiling, while a group of Eliarian guards stood motionless, their silver eyes watching every step without blinking. He had been in strange places before, on dozens of alien worlds, but this place felt different, older, wiser, and maybe even dangerous. In a quiet, graceful way, Queen Ophelia sat on her throne, not made of stone or steel, but something translucent, alive, shifting its shape as if breathing with her presence. Her face held no expression, just the eternal calm of her people, and her gaze pierced through Daniel like sunlight through glass. When she raised her hand, the hall fell silent. The Eliarians did not speak loudly. Their voices were like wind through water, soft but impossible to ignore. She welcomed him to their world, thanked him for the diplomatic efforts, and spoke of peace between the two civilizations. Everything seemed in order until she paused for a moment, and then said something that made the air in the room feel heavy, something no one had prepared him for. In a voice clear and echoing, she said, "We offer not just alliance, we offer unity through bond. I give you the hand of my daughter." Daniel stood still, thinking he had misheard, but no one laughed, and no one looked surprised. In their culture, this was not strange. Perhaps it was even expected as part of the peace deal. But for him, it was a storm he did not see coming. He looked toward the side, where footsteps echoed softly across the hall, and then she appeared. The Princess Elira stepped forward, dressed in flowing fabric that seemed made of starlight. Her movement was not like walking, but like drifting on gravity's edge. Her features were beyond beauty, not just in the way her skin shimmered, or how her eyes looked like twin nebulae, but in the way she held herself, perfect, poised, serene, and unreachable. Daniel had seen models and leaders and famous faces across Earth and colonies, but none of them had ever left him feeling like this, as if looking at her was like trying to hold fire with bare hands. He was not a man without courage. He had faced war and politics, stood in front of alien warlords, and survived near-death negotiations, but standing here facing this offer from a queen and this gaze from a princess who looked like a dream sculpted by time itself, he felt small, and for the first time unsure of how to speak. The queen leaned forward and asked in her usual calm tone, "Do you accept this bond with my daughter?" He looked at Elira, then back at the queen. The silence of the hall pressed in, waiting, watching. Time felt stretched, pulled into infinity, and finally his voice came. Not loud, not trembling, but steady and clear, and when he spoke, the words felt like they cut through the ceremony and the air like a blade. "She's too beautiful to love." The words echoed strange and sharp against the quiet walls. The Eliarians looked at each other, not with emotion, but with something colder, something calculating. The queen did not blink, but her head tilted just slightly, not confusion, but something like curiosity. Elira showed no reaction, her eyes still on him, calm as before, unreadable yet full of something deeper, perhaps a question, perhaps expectation. Daniel did not explain himself at first, and maybe that was what made the moment heavier. The tension grew like a wave waiting to break, but still he stood there unmoving, his eyes not on the queen, not on the guards, but only on Elira. And in that gaze there was something more than awe, something like fear, and something like sorrow. He thought of the humans back home, people who laughed, cried, stumbled, fought, grew together. He thought of how love came from shared pain, from flaws, from misunderstandings, and healing, none of which he could even imagine with Elira. She was not just from another world. She felt like she was from a higher plane, too perfect, too untouchable, too far above what he was, and maybe what anyone human could ever be. With someone like her, he would never feel like a man, just a shadow beside a sun. Yet the queen did not strike him down. The guards did not move. The hall remained quiet. Only the soft humming of the living walls filled the space. And then Elira finally spoke, her voice like wind over glass, gentle and balanced, and curious too. "Beautiful to love," she repeated, not as a question, but as if tasting the meaning in his words. Daniel nodded slowly, not with pride or defiance, but with the weight of honesty. Because beauty that perfect becomes a wall, not a door, and love needs a way. Through, not something to worship from a distance, she looked at him not as royalty, not as a symbol, but for the first time as someone real, and something in her gaze shifted just slightly, like a reflection breaking on water. The moment passed without drama, no cries, no anger, no refusal, just silence, deep and strange and ancient. The queen raised her hand again and said, "This response is noted. We will discuss further in private." Daniel was led away through another hallway. The Illyrian guard beside him said nothing, and neither did he. But the words still echoed in his mind, too beautiful to love, and he wondered not if he had insulted them, but if he had spoken a truth no one in their long perfect empire had dared say aloud. Somewhere behind him Illyria stood still in that great hall, her face calm, but her mind perhaps not as silent as before. And thus began the true story, not of peace or politics, but of understanding between beings whose hearts beat in rhythms the stars could never predict. Daniel walked through the long crystal hallway, surrounded by silent walls that reflected light from no clear source. The air smelled faintly of something clean and sweet, like air after rainfall, though there had been no rain on this world for centuries. They said the palace itself was grown, not built, shaped by Illyrian thought and energy, carefully formed by generations of still minds and perfect vision. Every surface was smooth, every angle elegant, every pattern flawless, and Daniel could not shake the feeling that he had stepped into something more art than reality, something too perfect to feel alive. The Illyrian escort said nothing, he simply led Daniel through corridor after corridor, until they reached a chamber smaller than the throne room, but still massive by human standards. A garden of floating stones and hanging vines shimmered in the air without gravity. They moved in slow circles, and glowing insects drifted like tiny stars. The room was quiet, but it breathed like a living thing, waiting and watching. Daniel sat on one of the floating stones and tried to gather his thoughts. He had not meant to offend them, but the truth had slipped from his lips without planning. It was not anger or rebellion. It had simply been the only thing he could say when faced with something that seemed more like a vision than a woman. His training in diplomacy told him he had made a mistake. His instincts told him he had spoken honestly, and honesty was dangerous when delivered to those who had not heard it before. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time moved strangely here, and then soft steps approached from behind, and he turned to see Illyria stepping into the garden chamber, her movements as smooth as before, but her eyes now held something different, not anger, not confusion, but something like thoughtfulness. She sat across from him without invitation, and for a long moment they both remained silent, the vines above them slowly twisting through the air in slow motion. She asked him if he would explain what he meant, and her voice carried no judgment. It was not a command, but a request, one spoken from someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Daniel told her about Earth, about how humans found love, not in perfection, but in the spaces between it, in the flaws, in the laughter that came after pain, in the way people fought and forgave and learned from each other. Love was not worship, it was not standing at a distance and gazing upward, it was falling down together and getting back up side by side. And that was something he could not imagine with her, not because she was not worthy, but because she seemed untouchable, made of light and balance and silence, and no one could hold on to that, not without losing themselves. As Illyria listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on him, her hands resting lightly in her lap like moonlight resting on water, and when he finished she asked if all humans saw love this way, or if it was only him, and he said many did. Though they may not have the words for it, they knew it deep inside, through experience, through heartbreak and healing, through the chaos of living and not knowing what would come next. She asked if he feared her. Daniel paused, then said no, but that he feared what she represented, a life where nothing could go wrong, because nothing ever did, a place without questions, without surprises, without mistakes, and to him that felt more like a dream than a life. And dreams were beautiful, but they faded when morning Camulira lowered her eyes for the first time since they met, and the silence grew deeper, not heavy, but thoughtful. And when she looked back up, her voice was softer, and she said, she had never been seen that way, not by her people, not by her council, not even by her own reflection. Because the Illyrian way was built on perfection, on harmony, on eternal beauty, and she had been raised to embody all of it, never breaking, never bending, never questioning. And yet, hearing his words, she felt something shift inside, something like a question that had never formed until now. She asked him what love felt like for humans, and he smiled a little and said it felt like home. Not a perfect home, not always safe or quiet, but real and filled with warmth and tears and noise and truth. And Illyria listened as if trying to imagine such a thing in a world that had never allowed it. She reached out then, not to touch him, but to hold her hand in the space between them, a gesture not of command, but of openness, and in that small act something unspoken passed between them, not love, not yet, not even friendship, but recognition. A moment where two different lives, two different truths stood side by side, not in conflict, but in quiet understanding. Daniel did not take her hand, but he did not pull away either, and that was enough for now. The garden continued to float around them, timeless and silent, but something inside both of them had begun to move, something uncertain and new and alive. Later that day, he met with an Illyrian advisor, who spoke in careful, measured tones and asked if he would reconsider the proposal if adjustments were made. Daniel asked what kind of adjustments, and the advisor spoke of calibrating Illyria's presence, making her appearance and energy easier for human minds to process, lowering the overwhelming beauty, the flawless aura, to something more compatible. Daniel felt a cold knot in his chest, and he stood abruptly, telling them no, that love was not something you edited or modified, that changing her to fit him would only create illusion, not truth. And the advisor simply nodded, as if noting data, not hearing pain, and that frightened him more than anything. He realized then that these beings, for all their wisdom, still did not understand what it meant to feel deeply, to fall and break and heal. That they knew beauty, but not emotion, not the raw, unshaped force that gave meaning to chaos. Walked out of the chamber and found himself thinking not just of Illyria, but of every moment he had lived, every flawed, imperfect breath that had brought him here. And for the first time he wondered if maybe this mission was not about peace between worlds, but about something deeper, about reminding one race what it meant to be truly alive. And somewhere high in the towers of the palace, Illyria stood alone, looking out over her endless city, and thinking not of destiny or duty, but of a smile. She had seen a real human smile, not shaped, not perfected, just full of something she had never known before. She whispered the word home, though she had never been there, and wondered what it might feel like to walk through chaos and still be love. Days passed slowly in the Illyrian capital. The sun did not rise or set in sharp turns like on earth, but moved in a graceful arc across a sky that never fully darkened and never fully burned. Daniel walked through the polished streets where the ground felt soft underfoot, and the air carried music with no source notes, drifting like clouds above silver rooftops. People here moved without rush, their faces calm, their gestures precise, their conversations quiet and smooth like flowing water. And yet, Daniel could not find joy in any of it, because it all felt untouched by time, untouched by life, untouched by struggle. Illyria had begun to walk beside him, not every day, not every hour, but often enough to notice a pattern forming. She asked questions about humans, not just about politics or systems, but about strange things like what it felt like to trip and fall, or what people did when they made mistakes, or how parents raised children when there were no royal protocols involved. Daniel answered her as best as he could, using simple words, not because she was slow, but because she had never heard truth spoken without filters before. He could see it in her eyes that shimmered with every word. He gave her eyes that had once been mirrors of control, now catching light and showing something uncertain behind them. They visited a temple where Illyrians meditated for long hours under glowing stones, each of them floating in silence, breathing in rhythm with the energy of the room. Daniel sat for a while trying to understand it, but all he felt was a pressure in his chest, a quiet that grew too loud in his mind, so he stood and walked outside, leaving the perfection behind. Alira followed him and asked what troubled him, and he said the silence was too smooth, too perfect, and that humans needed noise and surprise to feel alive. She did not understand at first, but then asked if maybe the silence was not peace but fear, and that made him stop and look at her with something close to respect. She began to tell him things she had never told anyone, not in open words, but in pieces, stories of her childhood. Not full of play or questions, but of long hours learning how to walk with balance, how to speak without flaw, how to smile in a way that pleased her mother, how to look at others without showing too much, because beauty was not just appearance here. It was law, and she had been made to follow it her whole life. She said that when she cried once as a child, the servants had left the room quietly, and her tutor had simply said, "Tears are not part of your path," and from that day she had trained herself not to feel more than what was allowed. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said that on earth children cry and shout and run and fall, and sometimes they are held, sometimes they are scolded, but always they are allowed to be what they are. And Alira looked at him like he had opened a door she never knew was there, not one she could walk through yet, but one she now saw clearly for the first time. Later that evening they attended a gathering of scholars where Eliarian minds presented theories on harmony and control. One speaker discussed the idea of emotional shaping, how their species could someday learn to adjust their feelings as easily as adjusting light levels in a room. Daniel stood and asked a question that silenced the hall. He asked if removing pain would remove learning, if removing struggle would remove growth, if a love without risk could ever be called love at all. Some eyes turned toward him with curiosity, others with hidden disapproval. But Alira watched him with something like pride, something that flickered and grew behind her. Carefully kept calm, the queen summoned him the next morning. Her voice held no anger, but her words were sharp. She asked if he intended to disrupt their traditions, if he was planting seeds of disorder in her daughter's mind. And Daniel replied that he was only speaking the truth as he knew it, and that perhaps what they feared was not his ideas but the possibility that their perfection had become a cage, not a sanctuary. The queen did not reply immediately, but her silence this time felt heavier than before. After he left the royal chamber, he found Alira waiting in the outer hall. She said nothing at first, but then told him something unexpected, that she had requested to visit Earth not as royalty, not as a bride, not as a symbol, but as a guest. She said she wanted to see the world through the eyes of those who laughed through pain and built beauty through mistakes. Daniel looked at her and saw not the Illyrian princess, the figure sculpted from light and control, but someone standing at the edge of something real, someone ready to step down from the throne of flawless silence into a world where nothing was guaranteed and everything was possible. He asked her if she was prepared for what she might find, the chaos, the noise, the imperfection, the unpredictability, and she nodded slowly, saying that perhaps it was not perfection that made life meaningful, but the freedom to fall and the strength to rise again. They walked together through a garden that bloomed with flowers of glass and energy petals, shifting color with each thought, each step, and Daniel thought how strange it was to be in a place so beautiful and yet feel so far from what he knew. And then he looked at her and realized that maybe she felt the same, and in that moment, they were no longer alien and human, no longer diplomat and princess, just two people who had seen the shape of each other's truths, and had not turned away. Later that night, as the stars above the Illyrian sky formed patterns shaped by ancient minds, Alira stood alone on the palace balcony, her eyes on the horizon where light met sky, and for the first time in her life she whispered her own name, not for duty, not for ritual, but for herself. And in that whisper was the beginning of something she had never been allowed to feel. And Daniel, back in his quarters, stared at the small photo he kept in his pocket, an image of his family, From years ago, laughing at a beach on Earth. Wind in their hair, sand between their fingers, not perfect, not quiet, not composed, but alive, and he smiled knowing that tomorrow something would change, not just for him or her, but perhaps for two worlds that had forgotten what it meant to be broken and still beautiful. The morning began with a soft mist curling through the great towers of the Illyrian city. The sky stretched endlessly with hues of blue and gold, blending like slow-moving waves. The palace hummed quietly as it always did, a song without voice, a pulse without rhythm, and Daniel stood at the edge of the inner courtyard, where translucent trees bent toward the center as if bowing to a secret wind. He waited, knowing the queen would summon him soon, not as a guest, but as a challenge. He had spoken words that shifted foundations. He had touched something ancient and silent inside the hearts of those who had not been touched before. Alira's request to visit Earth had stirred voices inside the royal court, not loud voices but deep ones, like stones moving under the sea. And now the queen wanted to understand whether Daniel was merely curious or truly dangerous. When the summons came, he walked with steady steps through the long corridor lined with floating mirrors, each one showing reflections that shimmered and shifted, as if confused by the presence of a man who refused to see only what he was supposed to see. The chamber ahead opened like a living mouth, and the queen sat upon her throne of light, her gaze fixed upon him, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with something sharper, something like disappointment wrapped in dignity. She asked him why he had come to her world, and he replied that he had come to speak of peace, to understand her people, and to share what made humanity strong. She asked him if peace to him meant refusal of unity, and he said peace without truth was not peace at all. It was silence dressed in silver. She narrowed her eyes and asked if he believed her daughter was not worthy of love, and he said her daughter was not the one unworthy. It was the idea of perfection that stole the breath from love. Before it could begin, the hall was quiet as he spoke. No guards moved, no ministers whispered, even the walls seemed to still themselves. And when he finished, the queen asked him if he knew what it meant to carry the weight of a civilization built on beauty and balance, a legacy that had never known war for generations, because it had shaped itself into order so complete that even sadness had no place to grow. And he said yes. He understood, and that was why he feared it, because perfection without emotion was not peace, it was paralysis. Then Alira entered the chamber, not in royal robes but in simple clothes, light and soft, without any shimmer, her hair loose, her face bare, her steps uncertain. For the first time she walked not as a symbol, but as a person, and her presence made the silence feel full, not empty, because she carried something new in her gaze, something that no one had ever seen before. In the daughter of the Illyrian queen, she turned to her mother and said she had lived all her life being shaped and watched and groomed into something perfect, something admired and untouched. And she had never known how empty that made her until someone dared to look past the beauty and speak of fear and honesty and feeling. She said she no longer wanted to be a statue carved by others. She wanted to walk among those who lived and stumbled and healed. Queen listened without interrupting, but her eyes held storms. Daniel had never seen in them before, not rage, but something more painful, something close to fear, and maybe even regret. She asked Alira what she hoped to find on Earth, and Alira answered she did not know, and that was the point: to not know, to not predict, to not control, but to feel and to grow and to choose. Daniel stepped forward and said he did not love Alira, not yet, and maybe never, but he respected her more now than anyone he had ever met, because she had begun to break the walls that held her prisoner in light and silence, and that was something no one else in this perfect world had dared to do. The queen stood slowly, her robe shifting like mist around her, and walked toward her daughter. She raised a hand, not in anger, but in something like farewell, and placed her palm lightly against Alira's forehead, not as a queen but as a mother, and then stepped back and said that if her daughter must go, then she would go, not as an offering, not as a weapon, not as a promise, but as herself. No celebration followed, no announcement, no council meeting. The decision was quiet and private, but it changed more than any war treaty ever could. Alira would go to Earth not as a bride, not as a figure of alliance, but as a being seeking something true and human later. Daniel found her in the garden where light moved through glass leaves like whispered dreams, and she sat beside a small pool, watching her reflection ripple with every breath. She asked him if he thought she was still too beautiful to love, and he said beauty was no longer what he saw. When he looked at her, he saw someone who had chosen freedom over safety, truth over ritual, someone who had dared to ask, "Who am I?" And that was something far more powerful than beauty. She smiled, then not the perfect curve of lips trained for ceremonies, but a small, uneven smile like sunlight breaking through uncertain clouds. And in that moment, she was more alive than any flawless sculpture ever made. He did not take her hand, but he sat beside her, and they watched the pool ripple together, not in silence but in quiet understanding. And in the stars above the Illyrian world, something shifted, something unseen but real, as if the universe itself had taken a breath and begun to listen. Starship waited on the edge of the garden, its surface smooth and silent, reflecting the glow of Illyrian towers and the wide-open sky that stretched forever across the horizon. Daniel stood near the base ramp, hands folded behind his back, watching as the last of the diplomatic crew finished their final checks. The trip to Earth would begin within the hour, but this departure felt unlike any mission he had ever taken, because this time someone else would be leaving something behind, more than territory, more than title, something invisible yet heavy, like the weight of choosing your own self after a lifetime of being shaped by others. Alira walked slowly toward the ship. No guards followed her, no servants trailed behind her, no regal robes touched the ground. Her attire was plain, her steps were steady, her eyes calm, but beneath that calm, there was something different, something unshaped and unfinished, something like the start of a real beginning. Her people watched from a distance, their expressions unreadable, not because they disapproved, but because they did not yet understand what it meant to let someone go without knowing what they might become. Daniel met her at the foot of the ramp. Their eyes met, and no words were needed for a moment, just that quiet shared space between two beings who had walked through questions and silence and truth. He gestured for her to board first, but she shook her head and looked once more toward the city that had raised her, shaped her, crowned her, and then whispered not a farewell but a promise. Not out loud, not in ritual, just a silent thought held deep in her chest. When the ship rose into the atmosphere, the planet beneath them shimmered like glass, and Alira sat near the viewing panel, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not speak, and Daniel did not disturb her. Sometimes silence was not the absence of words, but the presence of something deeper, and that silence stretched between them, gently like soft wind in a forest where new roots had begun to form. Earth came into view after several cycles, not in a flash of light, but in slow stages, clouds forming oceans, swirling lights from cities dotting the surface like scattered stories waiting to be read. Alira leaned forward, eyes wide, not in awe but in discovery. She saw the chaos, the beauty, the unpredictable layers that no design could replicate, and Daniel knew then that this was what she had come to find, not perfection, not order, not safety, but the raw pulse of life in motion. Her arrival on Earth was not announced with trumpets or flags. There was no press, no ceremony, just a quiet step onto soil she had never touched before. The air was thick, the noise constant, the people fast and full of energy, and for the first time, she looked around not as someone to be seen, but as someone ready to see. Daniel took her to a quiet town by the sea, where waves crashed against stone and children ran barefoot across sand, without protocol, without expectation. She stood barefoot among them for hours, watching, listening, even laughing once when a little boy handed her a seashell and told her it was a gift from the ocean. Her fingers closed around it slowly as if it might vanish. If she moved too quickly, she began to ask questions not about laws or history, but about feelings. She asked a mother how she knew when her child was afraid. She asked a fisherman why he still worked in the rain. She asked a baker why his bread tasted different every morning. and each answer added something new inside her, something unmeasurable. And alive Daniel watched from a distance, letting her walk her own path, letting her fall into moments that could not be shaped or predicted. One day, she stood in the middle of a marketplace where colors clashed and voices rose, and smells danced through the air, and she closed her eyes and breathed in deep, not to analyze but to feel, and when she opened them again, her eyes were not those of a visitor. They were the eyes of someone becoming part of something imperfect and beautiful. One evening, she found Daniel sitting on a bench by the sea. The sun had slipped halfway below the waves, and the sky glowed with shades of fire and soft gold. She sat beside him, holding the shell the child had given her. Her fingers still tracing its rough edges, she turned to him and asked if he still believed she was too beautiful to love, and he looked at her, not at her features, not at her form, but at her presence, at the way she now carried her own story, not the one given to her. Said no, not anymore, because beauty alone cannot be loved, it can only be admired, but a soul that chooses its own path, that breaks its own chains and seeks truth, even when the world asks it to stay silent, that soul can be loved fully, truly, without hesitation. She said she did not yet understand love completely, and he told her that no one really did, not even humans, that love was not a goal. It was a journey made of small choices, made of listening and changing, and sometimes hurting, and sometimes healing, and sometimes just sitting beside someone without needing to say anything at all. Wind picked up the waves, grew louder, but neither of them moved, and as the stars blinked awake one by one above them, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, not as a queen, not as a princess, not as a symbol, but as a person. And Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling not awe or duty or confusion, just a stillness that felt like home. Back on her world, stories began to spread, not in official channels, but in whispers. Quiet mentions of a royal daughter who chose to walk away, not to rebel, but to learn, and over time, those stories would shift something in the Illyrian heart, not through law, not through force, but through curiosity. Because once a single question is asked, it cannot be unasked, and Illyria had asked the most human question of all: who am I when no one is watching? And as Daniel and Illyria sat by the sea, under a sky that had never known her name, she answered it with every breath. She chose to take the end.